Hey, good morning, everybody. Look, got a lot to try to pack in today. I don't know if you um, have ever heard the account of when Jesus died on the cross, that it says that there was this veil in the temple that was torn in two at the moment that he died on the cross. And I want to explain to you a little bit about the significance of that. So before Christ died and in the Old Testament, some of y'all aren't going to like to hear this, but it's the truth. Before Christ died in the Old Testament, um, God's holiness prevailed, and not that it doesn't prevail now, but His holiness prevailed in that there was always separation. There was separation between God and His people in the Old Testament. It was based on His holiness, but it was separation. The whole thing was based on separation. I mean, God was so that veil covered this place called the Holy of Holies in the temple, and before the physical temple was built, in the tabernacle that God gave to Moses in the wilderness. And the thing is that the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, was behind that veil. And that was considered to be where God was. God's presence was above that mercy seat. It was right there. That was where God was. And if you wanted to meet with God, you had to go behind that veil and you had to go to that mercy seat, because that's where God was. Now, this was the way God set it up. This wasn't mankind. So, but here's the problem. You couldn't go behind that veil. Only one person could go behind that veil, and that was the high priest. And he could only go once a year. So you see, there was this separation between God and the people. And so when Jesus died, that veil being torn in two was symbolic that there would be no more separation, that we could all have access to God. We could have access to His presence and everything that meant for us. Now, as we live, even on this side of the cross, there is still a separation in our lives from God before we receive Christ. And that separation is our sin. Our sin separates us from God. Our sin damages our relationship with God. You see, before Christ, our relationship with God is off. It's separate. It's separated. But in the gospel, in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, Christ brings us and God back together again. The word is reconcile. He reconciles the relationship. He mends the broken relationship. He heals the broken relationship. He brings back together a separated relationship. So that's what Romans 5 verse 10 says. For it says, if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of His Son. It says when we were enemies, we were God's enemies. When we are lost, we are God's enemies. And you can go look at Ephesians. I preached a sermon a couple weeks ago that really brought this home from Ephesians chapter 2, about the first 10 verses, if you want to go listen to that. Outside of Christ, we are God's enemies. And it says, if when we're enemies, He used the death of His Son to reconcile our relationship, even though we were His enemies. He says, then how much more we will be saved through His life. You see, if when we were enemies, Christ's death reconciled us to God, now how much more that He lives because He rose from the grave, is He going to save us through His life? That He always lives, the Scripture says, to make intercession for us. He always lives. We are His inheritance. And He is going to continue to save. He is going to keep us saved, I guess is what I'm trying to say. He is going to keep us saved through the life of His Son, who is always interceding for us. So if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of His Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by His life. Let your relationship with God be brought back together and reconciled by the death of His Son, and then live in your inheritance as His inheritance through His life and in the security of your salvation. God bless you guys. I know that was kind of deep and it kind of went maybe where I didn't want it to go, but that's Romans 10:5. 5:10. I think it was really good. God bless you guys. Get out there in faith today. Love you. Bye.